It began with frost that clung to the bridge railings and shimmered in the pale light before dawn, while the river moved slow and dark beneath it, carrying the kind of silence that makes you listen harder because you already know something isn't right, and in that silence were footprints, one set, small, deliberate, leading to the edge, then gone, just gone, her coat folded on the railing, her handbag hanging from the corner, like she meant to come back, like she didn't plan to, disappear. And by morning, every person in Willow Creek knew her name, Clara Mayfield, 25 years old, the teacher with the red ribbon in her hair, the one who stayed late to mark papers, the one who walked to church alone on Sundays, humming under her breath. She was the kind of woman people noticed for her calm, for the way she smiled when she spoke to children, and now she was gone, the frost melting around her last steps, the town stirring awake to whispers that grew heavier by the hour. They said, maybe she slipped, maybe she ran away, maybe the river took her, but no one really believed that, because Clara Mayfield wasn't the kind of woman who left her coat behind in November, or her car still parked by the bridge headlights, cutting through the fog like tired eyes. She wasn't the kind of woman who left without saying goodbye, and if you think small towns keep their hearts clean, wait until you hear what Willow Creek kept buried for 50 years. So, stay with me, keep listening, and subscribe, because this one is different. This one is The Last Lesson. The last time anyone saw Clara Mayfield alive, the sky above Willow Creek was the color of wet iron, and the wind had that hollow sound it makes when it moves through empty cornfields. She stayed late at the school that night, the windows glowing soft gold, while the rest of town dimmed into silence. Her chalkboard still said, "Be kind, even when it's hard," and the smell of old paper and floor wax hung in the halls. She packed her bag, slow, placed her lesson book on top, turned off the lights, and walked down the front steps into the cold November air, her shoes clicking on the pavement, echoing across the playground, where swings creaked without a child in sight. She drove her green Plymouth toward the edge of town past the diner, where the same 4 men drank coffee and talked about the harvest, past the water tower that caught the last bit of light before the clouds closed in. She should have turned left toward Miller's Road, but the tracks from her tires later showed she went straight toward the bridge, the one locals called Devil's Crossing, because fog liked to sit there and never leave. Deputy Alan Reeves passed her car around 9:30. He remembered it, later said he saw her headlights. Parked by the railing, thought maybe she'd stop to watch the water, maybe her engine had stalled. He didn't stop. No one ever stops until it's too late sometime between that moment and sunrise. Clara vanished the next morning. Her car still sat there, idling low on fuel radio, whispering static from a Peoria station papers, scattered on the passenger seat, red scarf tangled in the gearshift like a vein of color. The gray. A fisherman found it first, said the driver's door was open, the inside light still glowing weak yellow against the fog. He looked down over the edge, saw only black water and his own reflection. By noon, Sheriff Lyle Hammond had men out walking the banks line by line, boots sinking into the mud. They found one glove by a fence post and nothing else. Her handbag on the railing still, zipped wallet inside, $12, 2 nickels, and a library card with her name printed, neat in blue ink. People from the church brought thermoses of coffee, wrapped sandwiches in wax paper, and whispered prayers. They walked until the sky went from silver to ash, until the lamps in town blinked on one by one, but the ground gave nothing. No drag marks, no blood, no trace of struggle. The sheriff wrote in his notebook, "Probable accident body carried downstream." But even as he wrote it, he didn't believe it, because her shoes were found side by side at the edge of the pram bridge, like someone had set them down with care and stepped out of her own life, like she'd known she wouldn't need them again by the second night. The town was holding vigils, candles flickering in front of the school, where her desk still waited untouched, and her students drew cards with crayon hearts and little messages like, "Come home soon, Miss Mayfield." But she didn't come home, and the river kept its silence, and by the time winter froze it solid, everyone in Willow Creek. We had learned to speak her name quietly, like it might still hear them somewhere under the ice. Before she disappeared, Clara Mayfield was the kind of person everyone swore they knew. Even if they didn't really, she moved through Willow Creek, like light through dust, soft and steady, touching everything without ever calling attention to herself. She rented the old farmhouse from the Martins out on Miller's Road, the one with the lilac bushes by the porch and the wind chime that never stopped. No matter how still the air got every morning, she left before sunrise, in that green Plymouth coffee in one hand, school books in the other, and by the time the first bell rang, the chalkboard was already waiting with perfect handwriting, and a row of pressed apples on her desk. She had 21 students that fall, and every one of them loved her. They said she smelled like cedar and peppermint, and that she never raised her voice, even when the boys threw erasers or the girls whispered during reading hour. When she smiled, it was the kind that made you want to do better. Not because you were afraid, but because you wanted her to be proud of. You, the parents, noticed too, said she had a way of calming people down, of making them feel like the world wasn't as cruel as it sometimes looked. The men at the diner said she'd make someone a good wife someday. The women at church said she already gave too much of herself for other people. And the sheriff later said that's what made her dangerous, not to others but to herself. Because people like Clara didn't see the shadows coming until they were already inside the room. On Fridays, she stayed late at the school alone with the sound of the janitor's mop and the ticking clock above the chalkboard. Sometimes she walked home if the weather was good cut, eyeing through the old orchard behind the playground, her shoes leaving small, clean tracks in the dirt. Sometimes she drove down to the river and parked there a while. Engine off, radio on, just sitting, watching the reflection of the bridge lights. In the black water, neighbors said she liked the quiet, said she needed it after a week of noise and children and voices calling her name all day long, and maybe that's why nobody worried when her car was seen near the bridge that night. Maybe they thought she was doing what she always did, taking a moment to breathe, the kind of moment that no one realized would be her last. After she vanished, the school held an assembly. The principal talked about hope and faith and moving forward. But the children kept looking at her empty chair, the one by the window where the morning sun used to fall across her papers. The janitor couldn't bring himself to erase her handwriting from the chalkboard, and the church ladies started bringing flowers to the steps every Sunday after service, until the scent of lilies mixed with the smell of chalk and floor wax and grief. Everyone in Willow Creek had a story about Clara Mayfield, and somehow they all sounded the same. She was kind. She was quiet. She didn't deserve this, and maybe that was the truth. Or maybe that's just what towns like Willow Creek tell themselves when they've already decided not to look too closely at the men who smiled too easily. The ones who always seemed to be around the school after hours. The ones who said she was like family while watching her just a little too long. At first light, the town moved as one bee, Odie, like a tide pulled by a single moon, and the sheriff drew lines on a map with a blunt pencil, while coffee steamed and the church bell counted the hour that no one would remember later, because time bends around fear, and in that bend, men, and women and boys, too young to be there, stood shoulder to shoulder on the gravel by Devil's Crossing, waiting for orders with their breath fogging the air, and their hands tucked into borrowed gloves, the kind that never quite fit, and Sheriff Lyle Hammond spoke low and steady, saying, "We walk in rows, we keep the distance of an arm, we call out anything that does not look like the river, and if we find her, We do not shout, because this is still a place of prayer, even if none of us say the word out loud, and they nodded, and stepped off the shoulder onto the frost-stiff grass, while Deputy Allen Reeves kept count with his fingers, and then lost count because the line kept growing, as trucks arrived, and the diner sent thermoses and the church sent blankets, and someone's mother sent a box of peppermint candies, because that is what people send when the silence gets too big to hold. They started where the green Plymouth waited with its weak light like a tired eye and a sound like breathing. That was only the engine whispering itself empty, and they fanned out in slow arcs along the bank into the reeds past the pilings, where the river licked at the wood and left a dark shine, and they moved that way for an hour, then 2, then 3, while the sun gave them nothing but a gray wash, and the dogs from the county seat came late and nervous and took the scent. From Clara. E.S. scarf and pulled hard toward the north and then stopped so suddenly that the handler stumbled because the path just ended at a scuffed patch of earth by the guardrail. And he said the thing no one wanted to hear. Which was it? Feels like. She left the ground, and the men looked at the water, and no one answered. They swept the shallows with poles cut from willow branches. They dragged the slow bend by the old mill with a rope and hooks that scraped the bottom and brought up weeds and a child's rusty wagon wheel, and a single shoe that did not belong to her, and they read every sign as if it were scripture. A broken reed, a smear of mud, a curl of red thread caught on a thorn, and when they found the glove by the fence post, a right-hand glove stiff with frost, Sheriff Hammond set it on his palm and stared at it like he was trying to remember the last time he had seen hope make a shape you could touch. And he said, "Bag it gentle like it could bruise," and Reeves nodded and did it and did not meet his eyes. By afternoon, the schoolyard was a staging ground, maps taped to the brick wall lengths of twine measured against the river bend, the principal standing with his hat in his hands, while children pressed their faces to the glass of the classroom doors until teachers led them away. 2 by 2, the church ladies set up a folding table and laid out sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper, and poured coffee that tasted like tin and comfort. And the talk turned thin and sharp as people remembered things out loud that they had not thought important. Yesterday, a black truck near the tracks, a stranger at the filling station, a figure on the bridge that could have been a shadow, and each story birthed a direction, and the directions multiplied, until the sheriff tore the map down and drew a new one that was just the river and the bridge and a circle wide, enough to hold their fear. As the light went shallow, they walked the timber past the old orchard through deadfall and briar, where coats snagged and left small, bright threads on thorns, and more than once a man called out only to apologize because it was just a bit of cloth or a scrap of paper, and in that way the day became a lesson in how absence is heavier than any body, and how sound can lie, because the river kept speaking in a low voice that sounded like a woman far away, and the wind moved through. Dry leaves like whispers and names, and still no answer came back. Near dusk, a boy from the high school found a set of impressions at the edge of the service road, not quite tire tracks, not quite footprints, more like a weight pressed and lifted, and pressed again, and he called the deputy over, and Reeves crouched and ghosted his hand across the cold dirt and said, "Maybe someone stood here a while and waited." And to the boy he said, "You did right," and to himself he said nothing, because the shape of that waiting felt like a door opening onto the sighs. The wrong room, and behind him in the thicket, a pheasant broke cover, and the whole line flinched as if the woods had decided to speak at last. They brought lanterns when the sun slid away, yellow eyes swaying in the mist. They moved slower then because darkness makes shapes where there are none, and by the time the sheriff came, he willed it for the night. People were already begging to keep going, and he said, "You will come back at first light, and you will go home now, and hold your children, because that is the only work left in the dark." And he stood alone a moment after. They drifted off, listening to the river and to the bridge and to the space between them, where Clara Mayfield had last been small and deliberate and present in the world. And he promised the quiet that he would not stop looking, and the quiet promised nothing back. By the fourth day, the air in Willow Creek had turned sharp and thin, like a knife left too long in cold water, and the town had learned the strange rhythm of waiting, the way it stretches every hour until it feels like punishment, and in that stretch, stories begin to multiply because silence always asks to be filled. So the stories came fast and unsteady from every corner of the county. Someone swore they'd seen a green Plymouth headed north toward Peoria. Someone else said they picked up a girl who looked like her near the grain silos. Another said a drifter with a torn coat was seen at the diner, asking questions about the school, and Sheriff Hammond wrote them all down one by one until the words on his pad blurred into noise. He sent deputies down the highway toward Alton, sent telegrams to bus stations and rail stops, posted flyers with Clara's photograph, and a number that rang day and night in his office until he stopped, hearing the bell at all. The men at the gas station said it was the stranger theory. Again, it's always the stranger theory, easier to imagine evil arriving from somewhere else than blooming quietly under your own porch. So the town clung to it like a prayer, said, it must have been someone passing through someone, nobody knew. And yet, in the same breath, they said, how could anyone do that to Miss Mayfield, as if it had been theirs to protect, and somehow they had failed her, and maybe they had, because behind every whisper was the same word, guilt, and no one said it loud enough for the wind to carry. The church held vigils, candles melting down to puddles that froze before morning. And the pastor said she was in God's hands now, which didn't sound like hope. It sounded like surrender, but people nodded because there was nothing else to do. The search parties shrank. One by one, the men went back to their fields, the women back to their kitchens, the children back to lessons taught by substitutes who spoke too loudly and smiled too much, as if brightness could replace her absence. And in that effort, the world grew smaller until the whole town fit inside the space of a rumor. Deputy Reeves kept a notebook of what he called the almosts, the tips that felt true for a minute, then vanished like breath on glass. The girl in the diner, the scarf found 10 miles downstream. The fisherman who pulled up a piece of fabric, that turned out to be a curtain. None of it held. He started visiting the bridge alone at night, smoking until the river fog swallowed him, and once he told the sheriff he could still hear her there, not her voice exactly, but the sound of a car. Door closing, the kind of sound that means somebody meant to come back. By December, the snow fell hard and clean, covering everything. Gee, that hadn't already been forgotten. The case file grew thick but empty. All paper and no proof, the green Plymouth was towed to the station and sat there under a canvas sheet engine. Rusting smell of oil and river clinging to its seats, and sometimes the sheriff would sit in it just to remember the weight of a thing that once carried her home and now carried only questions. The papers stopped printing her name after Christmas, said the county had done all it could that winter took her, same as it takes deer and foxes, and the town let itself believe it, because believing anything else meant admitting that someone among them had done it, someone who still bought bread at the market, someone who sat beside them at church and smiled and sang and shook their hands afterward. By spring, her posters had faded to ghosts on telephone poles, her students had grown an inch. Her sister had stopped coming to the station, and the bridge had learned to be quiet again. Only the sheriff kept his promise walking the banks when No one watched, tracing her path with the same tired steps each time, as if the ground might change its story and give her back. Because that's what happens when a small town runs out of answers. It builds its own truth to live inside and calls it peace. And for a while that lie holds until the woods decide they've heard enough and start whispering again 6 years. Later, when the thaw came early and 2 hunters cut across the marsh behind Miller's Road and found something pale and round breaking through the mud, something that made them both drop their rifles and run until their lungs burn. And that is where the real story began again, where the lie finally cracked and the river gave its first secret back. It was late March of 1961 when the thaw came early, the river spilling its skin across the low fields and the marsh behind Miller's Road, breathing again after 6 frozen months, and 2 hunters from town were out before dawn, chasing nothing in particular, just the kind of quiet that makes you forget things for a while. They followed the creek line, their boots sucking at the mud, when one of them tripped on something that wasn't wood or stone and fell hard, his hands sinking into earth that felt too soft, too warm, and when he pushed himself up, he saw it half buried in the black water, a shape pale as candle wax, a curve too clean to be chance, and he called out, and his friend came running, and they stood there, staring, because what they saw didn't look like the body of an animal. It looked like the start of an answer, and that terrified them more than anything else. They ran back toward the road, stumbling through cattails and bramble until they reached the truck, the one they'd borrowed from the feed store, and drove straight into town, mud frozen to their boots, breath tearing in their throats. Sheriff Hammond was still in his office. He hadn't shaved yet, still staring at the old case file when they burst in, talking over each other, voices shaking, saying they'd found bones near the creek, bones shaped like a person, and his pen stopped in mid-air. He didn't ask which person. He already knew. They went back out in convoy, the sheriff, the deputy, the coroner, a reporter from the local paper, even Reverend Collins, who refused to stay behind when he heard where they were going. The marsh was still half ice, half water, the ground trembling with every step, and they found it easily because the hunters had marked the spot with their jackets draped over a branch. The mud was black and thick and cold, and what it held was unmistakably human. The skull, just visible through the melt hair, still clinging to it in fine strands, the remains curled on their side as if asleep, a locket rusted against the collarbone, a scrap of fabric, pale blue and brittle between the reeds. The sheriff knelt down and didn't speak for a long time. The sound of frogs and wind filled the space instead, and when he finally did, his voice came out small. He said, "Bring her up gentle, like you'd lift your own daughter," and they did slow, with spades and gloved hands laying each piece on a canvas sheet until she was whole again, in the way bones can be whole and nothing else. As the coroner counted quietly, 1, 2, 3, until there was nothing left to count, the smell of the thaw mixing with the smell of old decay until everyone turned their faces away. By noon, the news had spread through Willow Creek faster than it ever had in 55, before any radio could confirm it. The town already knew the marsh had spoken, that the river had given her back, that Clara Mayfield had come home but not alive, and they gathered again on the bridge, the same faces older, now holding their coats tighter against the wind, saying the same words. Maybe she slipped. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it's better this way because the truth, Steve, ill, had no shape, and people need a shape to hold on to. At the morgue, Dr. Richard Fenn examined what was left, the way men examine the past, with careful hands and a hope that maybe science will forgive what faith could not. He said, "She'd been there at least 5 years. Maybe more," said the bones. He showed no sign of a fall or a fight, said there were traces of fabric deep in the soil that matched the dress from her photograph, But the rest he couldn't tell, not from what time had done to her. And so he wrote the words cause undetermined. Female approximate age, 20 to 30, possible trauma to the skull, and signed it like he was closing a prayer. They buried her as Jane Doe because no one could prove what everyone already knew, and the sheriff stood apart from the others, hat in his hands, while the pastor spoke of rest and release and forgiveness, and words that sounded thin against the wind. And when the last of the earth hit the wooden box, it made a sound so soft it could have been a heartbeat. Stopping, and the people turned away, and the sheriff stayed alone because he couldn't yet forgive himself for missing her when she was only 2 miles from the place he'd promised he'd never stop looking, and the marsh settled back into silence, waiting because the truth never really sleeps. It just waits for the right season to rise again. For a few weeks after the discovery, Willow Creek moved like it was half awake, caught between relief and disbelief, because finding her should have meant answers, but all it brought was more air and silence. And Sheriff Hammond wrote reports that went nowhere, and the coroner sent bones to Springfield, where doctors in white coats measured them under flickering lights and said words like inconclusive and undetermined. And he came home carrying that word like a disease. The papers ran one story and then stopped. The headline said body believed to be missing teacher, but by the next Sunday people were talking about crops again, about rain again, because normal is the only medicine a small town knows. Clara Mayfield became 2 words whispered in hallways and on porches, a ghost without paperwork and without proof. Reverend Collins said she was at peace, and maybe he believed it. Maybe he just needed to. The school replaced her name on the classroom door with another one, and painted over the spot where the children used to leave wildflowers, and the smell of wax and lemon oil covering what was left of her. Deputy Reeves packed up the evidence box himself, the locket, the ribbon, the brittle scraps of dress, the soil samples, all labeled, all sealed, and he carried them down to the basement where the air was wet and old, and left them there among the other lost things. And as he walked away, he swore he heard the faintest sound like chalk breaking on a blackboard. Every lead dried up before it reached daylight. The hunters were questioned again. The Martins, who'd rented her the farmhouse, were questioned again. The man who sold her gas the last week of her life was questioned again, each of them saying, and the same thing, that she was kind, quiet, careful, that she never made enemies, never made mistakes, that she was the last person this could happen to, and that was exactly the problem. Because, say, perfect people don't vanish without reason, and reason was something no one in Willow Creek wanted to face. Hammond sent a request to the state police for more manpower, and got a letter back that said insufficient evidence to warrant the continuation of investigation, and that phrase hit him harder than the winter wind, because he knew what it meant. It meant they'd already decided her story was over, and it meant that if he kept digging, he'd be the only one still holding a shovel. And he was tired, too tired to fight a file that no longer had a pulse. By the time summer came, the grass had grown over the place in the marsh where she was found, and the hunters stopped going there, said the ground felt wrong, said it, hummed when the wind came from the east. Children stayed away from the bridge. Mothers told them stories about the river, taking those who wandered too close, and in that way, Clara became a warning instead of a woman. Years later, his badge heavy and tarnished in his hand, the deputies boxed up his office and left the old case files stacked in the corner where dust drifted down like snow covering her name, one thin layer at a time, and the years moved. Without her, because that's what years do, they move, whether or not anyone deserves them. The river froze and thawed and froze again. People died and were born and left and forgot, and the bridge got new railings and new paint, and no one. He remembered that once there had been footprints there, leading to nothing. In 1965, The state closed the file for lack of evidence and sent a final notice stamped in red, cold CA. Say do not pursue. And the folder was filed under M for Mayfield inside the cabinet's second drawer from the top, where the handle squeaked, and even that small sound faded when the drawer closed, because silence is the final bureaucracy. It doesn't need approval, it just waits until everyone stops talking, and then it takes what's left. And for the next 40 years, Willow Creek lived like it never happened, like she had been a dream, someone once told that nobody quite remembered. Right. The school built new classrooms. The church added another bell. The marsh thickened with trees that hid the ground, and the house on Miller's Road got new paint and new tenants who never knew why the lilacs there never bloomed right. Again, and only the river remembered, because rivers always do, they just don't speak until someone finally learns how to listen. By the time the calendar turned to 2007, the world had changed. But Willow Creek had not. The bridge was wider, the railings brighter, but the air still carried that quiet ache that certain roads keep, and in the county archive basement, where light bulbs hummed and dust hung in slow motion, a man named Samuel Grayson was searching for something he could not name. He was 58, retired from the Illinois State Police, a man with a soft voice and a habit of tracing the edges of old photographs. With his thumb, he came down there one afternoon, looking for a file on a different case, and found instead the drawer that squeaked, and inside that drawer a folder stamped in red cold case. Do not pursue. He opened it because that is what people like him do, and something tells them not to. And there she was, Clara Mayfield, her school photograph paper yellowed corners curled, her eyes still steady, still looking straight at him. Across half a century he read every line, every note, the missing persons. Report the evidence, log, the sketches of the riverbank, the final statement from Sheriff Hammond, and it all felt wrong too, neat, too still, like a puzzle built from pieces that didn't belong together. He closed his eyes and could almost hear the faint sound of chalk on a blackboard, the way a teacher keeps writing long after the class has gone. Grayson had spent 30 years chasing ghosts of men who thought they were smarter than silence. He'd seen the way time eats evidence, but he'd also seen what new science could pull from old dust. And he knew what DNA could do now, what microscopes could see that human eyes had missed. And he thought if the world could split the atom and map the sky, then maybe it could give a name back to one woman who vanished before any of it existed. So he wrote a letter to the new sheriff, Daniel Price, asking for access to the old bones, to the files, to the photographs, and the sheriff wrote back 2 weeks later saying the remains were in Springfield storage, and the case was technically closed. But if Grayson wanted to look, he wouldn't stop him. He drove down the interstate, that fall windows cracked air, sharp with rain and asphalt. He thought about her face, about how still it was in that photo, about how the reports all described her as kind, quiet, generous, as if that was the whole of her, and he wondered how a town could live 50 years. Ours, with that much forgetting in its lungs when he reached the state lab. The technician on duty told him most of the old samples were too degraded to test, but there was one bone, a femur, still intact, stored with catalog tags faded to gray. Grayson stood there watching as the technician lifted it onto a metal tray, gloves whispering against the plastic, and said, "If we're lucky, there's enough to work with." He spent the next 6 months chasing paper trails, calling retired analysts, digging through boxes for anything that still held a trace of her. A hairbrush from her sister's house, a handkerchief found in the old evidence bag labeled "Personal Item Unknown." He built a case from ghosts and fragments and waited every night for the lab to call. sometimes falling asleep at his desk with her file open and the hum of the old fluorescent lights sounding like wind through reeds. By spring of 2008, the results came back partial mitochondrial. Sequence extracted from bone sample matched to personal effects from known family line. Probability 99.7%. The report said positive identification. Clara Mayfield, female Caucasian, age 20 to 30, time of death. Approximately 50 years prior, case reclassified homicide. And Grayson sat there staring at the paper for a long time because the room felt too small to hold what it meant. 52 years of silence, broken by a line of code inside a bone. Smaller than his hand, he drove back to Willow Creek that night, the town sleeping under thin rain. And when he crossed the bridge, the headlights hit the railings just right, and, for a second, he thought he saw footprints there again. Small, deliberate, leading toward the water, and gone he. Parked at the edge, cut the engine, listened to the river breathing below and said her name out loud, once, not like a prayer, not like a case file, just a name set free in the dark, and he promised her that he would not stop until someone finally answered her back. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, sealed in government gray with a barcode where a name should have been, and Sheriff Daniel Price held it like it might explode because in a way it already had. Inside was 50 years of waiting turned into paper, a few pages that began with the words mitochondrial match. Confirmed probability 99.7%, and ended with a single sentence. Case reclassified homicide, and for a moment no one in that office moved. Not the deputies, not the clerk, not even the clock, because they all knew what it meant. Clara Mayfield was no longer missing. She was murdered. Grayson stood in the corner, jaw tight, hands flat on the table, his coffee gone cold. He'd been the one who pushed for this, who wrote the letters, made the calls, and now that it was real, he felt none of the victory he thought would come, only the old weight shifting from one shoulder to the other, because bringing the dead back into the room means you have to start asking the living questions they'd buried with her, and he knew that was going to hurt. The state crime lab sent boxes up from Springfield, cardboard split at the seams, filled with evidence that hadn't seen daylight since Eisenhower was president. The gloves, the rye, bebon, the locket, all labeled with faded ink and still smelling faintly of damp wood and dust. The scientists took samples from every piece, every button, every thread. They ran the new tests that the old world couldn't dream of. Swabs, chemicals, machines humming like low voices in a chapel. And when the first reports came back, it wasn't what anyone expected. There were fingerprints, partials that didn't belong to Clara. They belonged to someone who had touched the fabric of her dress, someone who had lifted her coat from the railing, someone who had been close enough to leave a trace in her death. They fed the prints into the database and waited hours, stretching long and thin, until a screen blinked with a name. A partial match. An old record from the 1970s linked to a background check for a teaching license. Renewal. The name read Harold Deacon, retired principal, Willow Creek High School. Grayson stared at it, his pulse slow and heavy because he remembered the man, gray hair, clean suit, the voice everyone in town trusted, the one who gave speeches about decency and discipline, the man who had written letters to the editor every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, talking about faith and closure and forgiveness. And now here was his name, staring back from a machine that didn't know mercy. They pulled the old yearbooks from the library, dusty green covers embossed with gold script, and there he was, young, sharp, smiling, the kind of face that makes people feel safe. A line of text under his photo faculty advisor, Clara Mayfield, elementary liaison, and Grayson felt his stomach drop the way. It does, when you realize you've been looking at a shadow that always stood just behind the light. They found old memos from the school board confirming he had been assigned to observe her classes that fall to evaluate teaching methods. Nothing strange, nothing that would have meant anything then but now. Every line looked different, every word a crack in a mask. The next step was quiet, methodical. They got a warrant for his DNA, a buccal swab taken in the nursing home where he lived now. 84 trembling hands and eyes cloudy with age. When the cotton touched his cheek, he looked up at the nurse and said, "What's this for?" And she said, "Just routine, sir." And he smiled that same tired smile, the one that had fooled an entire town. And when the results came back 3 weeks later, the match was clean, no partials, no doubts, the same sequence found under her fingernails, on the ribbon on the inside of the coat folded neatly on the railing. Harold Deacon was the man who touched her last. Grayson drove out to the facility himself, the road empty, the fields pale gold under low cloud, and when he walked in, the nurse pointed him down the corridor to a room that smelled like bleach and old time. And there he was, the man everyone he had trusted, sitting by the window, a blanket over his knees, a stack of crossword puzzles beside him. He looked up when the door opened, and for a second there was recognition, like some part of him had been waiting for this moment since. 1955. "You found her," he said, and his voice was small, like paper tearing. Grayson nodded and said, "Yes, sir, we did," and Deacon looked back the window, where the light broke across the glass and said, "I always knew she'd come home." They brought in a recorder, small red light blinking in the corner of the nursing home room. The air too warm, the curtains drawn tight, and Harold Deacon sat there wrapped in a gray blanket, fingers trembling against the fabric of his chair. The nurse stood near the door, silent, while Sheriff Price and Samuel Grayson took their seats across from him. Grayson pressed the button, said for the record, "State your name," and Deacon's voice came out. Soft, cracked, Harold James Deacon born. July of 1922, retired principal, Willow Creek High, and then he stopped, eyes blinking fast like he was trying to remember how to breathe. And Grayson leaned in, said, "Mr. Deacon, we're here about Clara Mayfield," and the room went so still, even the clock seemed to hold its breath. At first, he said he didn't know her, not really, said she was just one of the young teachers from the elementary program that he'd supervised for the board. But the way his hands shook gave him away, and after a long silence he said, "I used to watch her walk across the schoolyard. She'd always have papers in her arms and that red ribbon in her hair, and she'd smile at everyone like she didn't know the world was cruel." And Grayson said, "Tell me what happened." And Deacon's eyes filled with something that looked like exhaustion more than guilt, and he said, "I never meant to hurt her." He talked for an hour, voice thin and wet at the edges like paper disintegrating in water. Said he'd stayed behind the night she disappeared. Said he had gone to speak with R about transferring. One of her students said it was supposed to be nothing serious, but he'd been drinking a little scotch from his desk bottle to calm his nerves. And when she turned to leave, he told her that he thought about her too much, that she made him forget who he was supposed to be. And she laughed, not cruelly but gently, the way a teacher does with a child who doesn't understand. And he said that broke something inside him, something that had been holding for years. He followed her out to the parking lot, begged her not to tell anyone, grabbed her wrist when she tried to walk away, and when she pulled back, he shoved her. She fell, hit her head on the open car door, slid down and didn't move, and he said he stood there for a long time, waiting for her to breathe again. And when she didn't, he drove her car out to the bridge, left it running, folded her coat, placed it on the railing like an apology, carried her in his truck down to the marsh where he buried her with his own hands. Grayson sat without writing anything, his mind filling the gaps that 50 years had left behind. The cold air, the sound of the river, the stillness of that bridge. Deacon kept talking, said he went home to his wife that night, said he could sleep, said the next morning. He looked in the mirror and saw someone else staring back, and that someone never left. Said every year when the anniversary came, he wrote letters to the paper because he thought if people kept praying for her, maybe God would forgive him too. And he said, I used to walk by her classroom when no one was there, just to listen to the air, like maybe she'd still be teaching in it. When the confession ended, the nurse was crying quietly in the corner, and the sheriff switched off the recorder, with a click loud in the small room. Deacon looked at them both and said, I know what comes next, and Grayson said, I think you've been waiting for it a long time. He nodded, said, I have, but not for punishment, for permission to stop remembering. And when they stood to leave, he said one more thing. Tell them she didn't scream. I don't know why, but she didn't scream, and maybe that's what mercy sounds like. He died 3 months later before the trial could begin. Heart stopped in his sleep. The coroner called it natural causes. But Grayson didn't believe in that. Not after all this. Some deaths, he thought, are earned, not given, and when the news reached Willow Creek, the town gathered again at First Methodist Church, the same one where Clara's students once lit candles, the same pews, the same hymns only. Now they sang softer, as if the walls themselves could still hear her voice, and when the service ended, no one spoke. They just walked out into the cold in small, careful steps, as if afraid the earth might open again. Spring came early to Willow Creek that year, soft rain washing the salt from the bridge, and for the first time in half a century, the air didn't taste like waiting. The marsh bloomed too early, lilies pushing through the soil that had hidden her for so long, and Sheriff Price drove out there one morning alone, parked by the tree line, stepped into the grass that still remembered footsteps, and stood where the ground had given her back. He said her name once, not like a report, not like a duty, just the way you say a word that feels heavier than sound, and then he let the silence take it. They held a new service that May won without sermons or speeches, no cameras, no papers, just 30 or so people who had never stopped caring, even if they pretended to. Clara Mayfield finally had her name carved in stone beside her parents. Under a maple tree near the edge of Oak Hill Cemetery, the engraving, clean, simple, no date of death, only the year she vanished and the year she was found, and between them a dash that meant 52 years of silence, and everything that had lived inside it. Samuel Grayson stood at the back coat collar turned up against the drizzle. He'd promised himself not to speak, but when they started to leave, he stepped forward and placed the old case file on the ground beside her grave. The pages bound. With twine said, "She belongs to you now," and he walked away. To slow down the path past the children who didn't understand why grown men looked so tired, and past the church steeple that had watched over all of it from the beginning, past the town, that had learned that justice doesn't heal it, only ends the guessing. After the confession, people asked how no one had ever seen it, how a man who shook every hand in town could hide a crime so cruel behind a smile. But Willow Creek already knew the answer because evil never looked like monsters there. Looked like a neighbor helping to fix your fence, like a voice reading scripture on Sunday, like a principal who said he cared about every child in his school, and maybe he did. Maybe that's what made it worse. The school took her name for the new library. A small plaque by the door that says in memory of Clara Mayfield, teacher, mentor, friend, and the children. Pass it every day without knowing who she was. But sometimes they say her name out loud because it sounds pretty, and that's how ghosts survive. They live in repetition. They live in the mouths of those who never knew them. At night, the bridge still hums, the same low tune, the river slow and silver under the moon. The sound not of danger anymore, but of memory, holding on, and if you walk there just before dawn, you can see the faint outline of footprints that come and go with the frost, small, deliberate, leading to the edge, then gone again. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear her voice carried by the mist, gentle, steady, whispering like a lesson that never ends, because that's the truth. About towns like Willow Creek, they don't bury their secrets. They grow over them and call it peace until the roots push back through the earth and remind them what they left undone. And when that happens, all you can do is listen. Who believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered? If you believe silence isn't the same as peace, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're going deeper into another forgotten truth. Another place where the river never. He stopped whispering. This was the last lesson.